Hello there and welcome to another edition of Ask David. Still loads of questions flooding in, you're gardening like fury, so let's get on and answer those pressing gardening questions. So to start us off, Phil and Sheila have contacted me about their pineapple broom. Now they say they planted it about 18 months ago. It's grown really strongly, but it's tended to grow more on one side than the other. It's quite tall now, about 3 meters in height, and they're worried that it might blow over. They've added a stake to try and support it, but they're wondering whether any pruning would be beneficial as well. Well, the thing here is, Phil and Sheila, that I would definitely prune back those vigorous, strong stems back by about half their height. So if the total size of the plant is about 3 meters, then cut the whole thing back down to about 1.5 meters. Prune back to buds that are facing in the direction that you want it to grow. So I would prune to buds that are facing towards the weaker side of the plant, and then trim off the weaker lower stems lower down. That vigorous pruning will allow the plant to get really good root establishment before the top growth starts to grow again this summer. You'll still get flowers this year, and that advice also goes for many other plants that have been, particularly shrubs that have been planted in the last year or so that might be looking a bit lopsided. Prune them hard back to get them to bush from low down and to re-establish a good balanced shape. Next on the list is Anne. She says that she's got a bag of salad potatoes in the kitchen that have started to sprout, and she wonders whether she can plant them into a potato bag and grow some potatoes for later on this summer. Well, the answer to that is definitely yes, a big thumbs up. You would normally buy proper seed potatoes from a garden centre or a DIY store and plant those because they would tend to be certified as being pest and disease free at the time of planting. But these sprouted potatoes, as long as they look healthy, should be fine to go in the ground or into a potato bag of really good quality compost, and then plant them in the bottom of the bag, allow them to sprout, and then gradually fill in the bag, unroll the sides as you go, fill the bag up gradually with more compost to what's effectively earth them up so that you're covering the lower portions of the stem, and that way you'll get more side shoots on the vigorous growths, and that will produce an abundant crop of potatoes. So with that one, Anne, good luck. Louisa's got in touch to ask David about her flowering quince. Now she says it's an ornamental quince, it hasn't been touched for about 10 years and it's a really big specimen, and she's wondering whether she can cut it hard back at this time of year. And the answer there again is yes, prune it hard back, perhaps leave 1 or 2 of the main branches in place with some foliage on it, just so that the plant doesn't get too much of a shock. It might look a bit ungainly and ugly to start with, but those branches will help to feed the rootstock of the plant and keep it growing away strongly. And you should, if you cut the rest of it hard back, see some new shoots coming from low down, and as soon as those shoots get to a few centimetres long, you can then cut the remaining branches down to the ground and start again. Next, it's a question about some unusual rose growth. Easwary has got in contact to say that these roses have got growth that looks a little bit clustered together, rather like a congested witch's broom, and the growth doesn't look very typical at all. It's quite thin-leaved and stringy. Fungicide has been applied, but it doesn't really seem to have made any difference. Now, the same thing happened last year as this year, and Easwary, I think that you've got some weed killer in there of some sort. So when you sprayed, I think that there may have been an application made using a sprayer that had been used for weed killer previously, and generally speaking it's either glyphosate weed killer or any other sort of systemic weed killer that has been used in that sprayer before, and then you think you've rinsed it out thoroughly, but even the slightest little taint of that weed killer in that sprayer can affect roses in this way. It's typical what's called herbicide damage on roses to get that sort of growth. Now the thing is if you are going to make any spray applications onto roses, to make sure that it is a completely clean new sprayer that hasn't been used for weed killer before, because as I say, even if you think you've washed it out, you won't have got rid of every trace. Now with Easwary's roses now, the best thing to do really is to lightly fork the soil around the base of the plant, very lightly with a border fork, and then apply a mulch of organic compost, so either homemade garden compost or bagged compost around the base. Try and keep it away from the stems themselves. Don't go closer than a couple of centimetres to the stems than you can, and make a mulch mat, if you like, around about 2 inches or 5 centimetres deep all the way over the soil. And if there is any residual herbicide in the soil now, that will be absorbed by that organic compost and hopefully locked up so it can't be taken up by the plant. In the meantime, keep the plants reasonably well watered. If you get any vigorous distorted stems, then prune them back by about half their length. It won't benefit if the plant tries to start to flower, because that will weaken the plant. And then nurture those plants really carefully in that way for the next couple of years, and sometimes it takes a couple of years for roses to grow out of that. And if they really do stay that miserable looking with all that ferny foliage for any longer than a couple of 3 years, then to be honest, the best thing to do is dig them out and replace them with some fresh plants. But also remember to dig out some of that soil as well, so that you're putting fresh soil from another part of the garden into the place where you want to plant the roses, so that they can grow away without the effects of any residual herbicide in the ground. Now lastly this week, Simon has got a question about his cloud pruned Ilex crenata. He sent me a picture. It's a really lovely specimen, but as he says, the foliage is starting to go a bit brown and he's concerned about it. He's growing it in a shallow bowl, and obviously he wants to maintain its shape. He wants it to be about 5 foot in stature, in height, and he's wondering what he can do to help the plant. Well, Simon, there's 2 things here. One is that they think that the plant growing in that shallow bowl may be under stress because it's got a restricted root run, and it's relying on you for every bit of water and every bit of feed that it gets. That's the basic problem with growing anything in a container, albeit a very small one in this case, proportioned to the size of the plant. So one way would be to relieve the plant's stress by taking it out of the pot and planting it directly into the ground, and then you can easily let it maintain that 5 foot stature and keep pruning it back regularly. The other thing is that with most evergreen plants, it's the same scenario. Those evergreen leaves aren't like plastic, they won't live forever. So those evergreen leaves at the base of each of the stems ultimately has a shelf life. So if you keep pruning back the new growth, back to that old foliage, you'll gradually find that the leaves that are exposed will start to turn brown because they can only live for so long. So the key thing here is to let the plant gradually get a little bit bigger each year, only a little bit, by pruning the vigorous stems back down to 2 to 3 leaves from the base, so that it can gradually get bigger and those new leaves can stay on the plant for a long time. Once you get to a certain size that you think this is starting to get too big, then you can prune those stems hard back to encourage some regrowth from lower down that you can train back into that cloud formation. But ultimately you have to let the plant get slightly bigger so that the new leaves can stay green. So that's it for another week. Don't forget, if you've got any pressing gardening questions, you can get in touch to Ask David through gardenersworld.com. In the meantime though, stay alert, keep gardening and be happy.